Hello, and welcome back to the Week 1 lecture, Part 2, for APG5365 Principles of Global Media and Communications. This unit tries to understand how debates in the field of globalization and communications are evolving. Basically, we're trying to understand how processes or systems of globalization and communications are reinforcing each other and how they are presenting new and sometimes unresolvable tensions. This video introduces considerations of how processes of globalization have changed the way we conceive of communications. That is how we think about, research, and debate communications processes. We consider traditional models that have been used to try to understand the field of communications and how processes of digitization are affecting them. Are they changing them, revising them, making them more problematic, for example? In this video, we will begin to look at what these conceptual approaches might be, approaches that we will then go on to look at in more depth through the course of this unit. We will be particularly interested in two dimensions of communications within these new globalized spheres. One is global scales of processes and activity, and two, global approaches to conceptualizing communications. This week, we'll consider how researchers have tried to understand these dimensions and how they are changing. Dimension 1, global scale of processes and activity. Here are some areas to start you thinking about Dimension 1. Global market expansion. For example, global delivery of goods and services. Think about how communication and media products flow around the world and how old constraints of time and space have changed. But also consider how recent disruptions during the pandemic have affected these processes. Global corporatization and financialization, how structures of media and communications industries are changing, how companies and organizations are going from being locally and nationally based to expanding into transnational conglomerates in many cases. The rise of global communication corporations, for example, News Corp and Time Warner, is part of a global network of business. Tied to this is an increasing reliance on global financial markets, such as information on stocks and share markets. Rapidly expanding new media organizations, such as Facebook, Apple, and Google, are financed globally and have a global network of business structures. Also think about the need for global regulation, how we are seeing regulation increasingly moving away from the control of national governments to the global level, to multinational corporations and to global institutions. An example of global institutions is the World Trade Organization. And also think about the International Telecommunications Union. With this global scale of activity and flows comes a range of complications or gaps in regulations. What do you do when there are incidents that take place across borders and governments simply don't have the reach? This is one of the most pressing concerns in the context of global communications activity. Some issues connected with this are security, breaches, loss of data, criminal activity, privacy issues, surveillance, censorship, government control. And on crime and trafficking, how we police these matters, whether they are in fact policeable when you take away national borders. In this context, the relationship between globalization and communication is tremendously complex. On the one hand, there's no question that communications today has been transformed in operating at a global level. But on the other comes this range of complications that are not easy to find solutions to. As we go about our day-to-day life, Most of us don't think very much about artificial satellites, but pretty much everything modern is controlled by these satellites: military, civilian, and commercial interests, and especially communications. Since the former Soviet Union launched the first satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, the technology of communications has changed profoundly. For example, millions and even billions of citizens around the world can watch the same thing at the same time, all based on satellite transmission. In 2021, there are around 2,800 active artificial satellites orbiting the Earth, with the US owning about half of them. Actually, there are about 6,000 satellites orbiting the Earth at the moment, but more than half of them are no longer operating and are forming what is called space junk. There's more about this in the article on the slide from the World Economic Forum. Satellites have been used for many decades to photograph the Earth and to track and analyse changes. One of the areas of concern in regard to climate change is the Arctic region. If you're interested in this field, access the slides on Moodle and you can click on the link to see a NASA video about collecting this information. Of course, NASA, being the National Space Agency of the US, has its own agenda to set, and its expert social media team frames issues it wants the public to discuss, not just in the US, but of course, globally. In this unit, we'll explore how this global approach we have discussed currently affects the way we think about communications, the way we have theorized communications. In the context of Dimension 2, a key approach is the idea of the public sphere. This is a concept put forward by the German sociologist and philosopher Jürgen Habermas in the 1980s and debated ever since. If you've done undergraduate studies in media and communications, you may well have heard of Habermas. He's now aged 91 and at the time of recording this video is one of the most respected living scholars in this field. Basically, the public sphere is a space or sphere in which citizens or the public can discuss important issues. But unless you live in a small isolated village, it's impossible for all citizens to come face to face to discuss these things, and particularly these days as we face the pandemic. Groups of citizens need a medium through which they can debate. Habermas says that this medium is the field of media and communications, and of course we interact via platforms. This allows us to learn more about different issues, the world and how it works, then to form opinions and make decisions about how we think our society should work, and even to influence how the state reacts to such complications. This week's set reading is a 2008 article that draws upon Habermas's concepts of the public sphere. It's titled The New Public Sphere, Global Civil Society, Communication Networks and Global Governance. And it's by another revered scholar, Manuel Castells, a Spanish sociologist. Castells notes that communications and media networks are central to the modern public sphere in the information or digital age. They provide the space through which citizens engage with one another to discuss issues of society. In this way, the public sphere is seen as a cornerstone of democracy, a space between official government systems and the private individual. The public sphere is increasingly present at a global level. This complicates the matter. If the public sphere is a space between state and society, what happens when communications are taking place at a global level and no longer within national boundaries alone? And of course, not every country is a democracy. So how does this change the way the public sphere might work? Recent examples are the US presidential election and discussion and information about the pandemic. In these two examples, we can see that transnational individuals, organisations, state institutions, civil society groups, and so on, all participate in a conversation at multiple levels. And we can see that transnational media systems and technologies provide the infrastructure through which these conversations take place. But Habermas and other scholars also argue that mass media is not an ideal public sphere because it can promote false consciousness. That is, it can stop people seeing society's real problems and makes people complacent, thus less likely to discuss meaningful political change. You might be familiar with the terms echo chamber, silo, and fake news in regard to current media. To help us understand some of the different ways in which we approach the field of communications, we will look at a number of traditional approaches over the next few weeks. And as we look at each of these, we'll try to understand how each is evolving as communication systems are becoming more and more global. We'll examine in the next 3 weeks conceptual approaches that will help you with your understanding of the issues involved in this unit. So week 2, we'll look at political economy. This is about institutional structures, ownership, and regulation. It's interested in understanding how media and communication systems are organized, who owns them, how they are structured and regulated. How does this structure and organization influence the media content they produce? At its essence, it asks who has the power and who has the money in media, and what are the effects on societies? In week 3, we have 2 topics. Number 1 is representation, communications as cultural flows. In this, we'll be trying to see how ideas and identities circulate in the field of communications. What ways of understanding the world do media representations offer? If we see media as a window to the world, what view or views of the world does it show us? And the second topic for week 3 is audiences. So the interest here is less about what media organizations are doing and more about what viewers or audiences are doing as both consumers and producers of media. We'll consider the impact of media content. How do audiences react? Over the years, there has been a shift from passive to active audiences. The discipline of media and communications studies has moved from just looking at what media do to people to what people do with media, and even to how audiences use media. The boundary between producers and users or consumers has blurred, and there is also the state that more than half the world's population can now engage with content at a global scale, as long as we have access to this technology, of course. In week 4, we look at digital disruption, policy and regulation. This looks at the global and social impact of technologies and how this has affected the ways we understand media and communications. We've gone from models of media largely about one-way flows to an era in which media are increasingly more networked, more interactive, more participatory. So from this approach, we're interested in seeing how this interactivity and networking across borders is in so many ways changing the communications landscape. Over the course of this unit, we'll engage with each of these conceptual approaches. We'll explore what these approaches have to offer us in our understanding of the field of communications and media studies, and how they are changing and adapting in the context of the effects of globalization. In weeks 5 and 6, we will concentrate on how to design, research, and write a scholarly essay at master's level, which is the final assessment in this unit. And don't forget to work through the Module 1 lesson on Moodle. Thank you for viewing. See you next week.